Good morning, everybody. It really is a pleasure to start our conversation today. Thank you, everybody, for coming in. I imagine, as Jars has pointed out, our conversation will focus on all kinds of dimensions and directions which this field, self-identified field, as Ukrainian-Canadian studies, is pursuing. I also imagine our foci and accents in today's conversation, especially in this panel, will be somewhat different in comparison to what we were reflecting on challenges and directions in generally speaking Ukrainian studies. And I will point out why I think, I imagine my colleagues will follow up on several points that I'll be pointing out. I think by the nature of me being first, I've opted out to first present some general understanding of mine. What is the field? What are the challenges and dimensions of it? And because I believe in dialogue, I also am focusing on in the second part of my talk on the Ukrainian-Canadian studies in Ukraine, actually, given the presence of experts in the field as it involves in Canada. This is the reason why I thought I'll introduce a different dimension to it. And it's always a challenge to figure out who are we talking to in this particular area. And I have decided in my mind that I'm addressing the students and the community who I teach and with who I work in principle. So my first and short definition of the Ukrainian-Canadian studies would be to probably point out that this is an exploration of Ukrainian-Canadian legacy defined in broad terms from a given disciplinary perspective. And of course, the legacy can be defined here differently and narrowly or broadly. And also we can probably follow up on at least two possibilities here, how we can translate this broad term. We can speak about Ukrainian studies or Ukrainian legacy, culture, history in Canada, and that often is the pursuit of so many of us. But we also can think of Ukrainian-Canadian legacy in broader terms and actually use and operate with the adjective Ukrainian-Canadian through the hyphen. Ukrainian-Canadian ethnicity, culture, heritage, history, and society. In my opinion, the second perspective possibly opens up new opportunities for us in the field to pursue, which involve the idea of comparative analysis, some dialogue with other areas of study or regional studies or diaspora studies, ethnic studies, and so on and so forth. So there are at least two possibilities how we can proceed with understanding this scholarship. As Jars pointed out, we are talking about a very diverse field, which is informed by disciplinary perspectives, and we can have this list expanded, sociology, anthropology, political studies, and so on and so forth. But I want, in addition to the list, which of course is extensive, as we all know, I also want to point out that we work at the intersections of such fields as public history and local history. And that actually brings in a lot of uniqueness into what we do, especially when it comes down to dialoguing and conversing about what we do with colleagues outside of our field. So we can probably still work with this sort of a short definition or a short understanding of what we are working on in this field. And perhaps, but all in all, Ukrainian studies are about Ukrainian-Canadian content and a disciplinary approach, angle, methods, perspective, and so on and so forth, which of course introduces new parameters, new dimensions, and positions us as scholars very differently because we are, we have responsibilities and obligations which are beyond and above of the which are outside of specifically Ukrainian-Canadian study areas. When considered in the context of university-based academic studies, dare I say that Ukrainian-Canadian studies are actually on the margins of both, on the margins of the Ukrainian studies and on the margins of the disciplines which we pursue and represent and in the academic world. I don't see, or I don't really foresee in the near future in my university, for example, of having a program which will focus single-handedly on Ukrainian-Canadian content as such. We build Ukrainian studies, and within the Ukrainian studies we work on the topics which are conveniently or housed under the umbrella of Ukrainian studies as well. But of course, this structural marginality obviously presents different challenges to scholars who are engaged in the pursuit of these area of studies. But at the same time, in spite of this marginal status in our academic fields when it comes to academics placed in universities, this field of scholarship is extremely important to the Ukrainian-Canadian community. It financially supports this area of studies, and it's interested in its continuity and its outcomes. And that ultimately what defines oftentimes what we do, how we do, and how we also communicate between the two domains. So this brings me to this important point that in this field of study, Ukrainian-Canadian studies is actually an excellent example of what nowadays scholars discuss in terms of community-engaged scholarship. So community-engaged scholarship is a subfield of academic pursuit in social sciences and humanities, is a huge new area of exploration, multidisciplinary, of course, and it's growing field, and it's a recognized field of its own. And we are the precursors. We as Ukrainian Canadians, we are very much behind, not behind the field, but we are also in the avant-garde of these kinds of pursuits in Canada. And this has not been yet discussed in fullest sense within the context, say, of community-engaged scholarship, something for us to do. But Ukrainian-Canadian studies are shaped, of course, at the intersection of both academia and community, and not only in terms of who orders the music and who plays it, but rather in a complex interaction between these two fields. It is an academic-based scholarship on one hand. On the other hand, it is a community-based scholarship. And also we understand that we pursue our scholarship very much in collaboration and interaction and in dialogue between these two fields, and oftentimes it's very hard to draw a line between them two as well, something which we puzzle with our university administrations from campus to campus, and sometimes actually enlighten those administrations as well, as long as they embrace this rich formula of scholarly pursuit, which I've referred to as a community-engaged scholarship. We also teach, of course, in this area of studies, perhaps not on every campus in Canada where Ukrainian studies are, but here in the West we do. And it is in teaching that we recognize the necessity of that bridge between the community and between the academia, because we not only benefit from the field because we research it, but we certainly recognize that what we do at the university can be of benefit to the museums, to the archival institutions which we work on, and it certainly is the case with the Prairie Centre for the Ukrainian Heritage and local cultural Ukrainian-Canadian institutions in the city, such as the museums, for example. Let me move on. So we speak of Ukrainian-Canadian studies predominantly in the context of this scholarship unfolding in Canada, but of course it takes place elsewhere. And if you imagine where those two large intellectual domains would be, and one would be certainly Canada, but interestingly enough, we have huge burgeoning field of Ukrainian-Canadian studies, though maybe not conceived exactly in those terms, in Ukraine as such, but also not in Ukraine as well. But predominantly, these are the two domains. We also speaking of some geographic distribution of that activity or that phenomena, I'd rather speak of Ukrainian-Canadian studies as cultural phenomena, scholarly phenomena, rather than simply pursuit and activity. We also live the divide of West and East here in Canada. We predominantly, when we speak of, or when I talk to my students, I oftentimes begin exploring complex ideas with the question, what comes to mind when you hear such and such construct and notion? So what comes to mind when you hear Ukrainian-Canadian studies? Typically, Western Canada, typically discourse on the founders or on the early pioneers, and so on and so forth. This is predominantly what has been intriguing people here, and as well as in Ukraine, in the West, I mean. But the Ukrainian-Canadian legacy is bigger than that, and wherever I travel to the eastern part of our country and have an opportunity to present my own understandings of what is Ukrainian-Canadian studies, I get to hear interesting reflections on how oftentimes what we pursued here in the West excludes the experiences and reflections on what it means to be Ukrainian Canadians in the East. So this divide needs to be somehow dealt with. Speaking of the pursuits, Jars has mentioned what we do. We can speak of historical research. Sometimes it's just purely archaeographical, but sometimes, of course, it's conceptual. Fieldwork-based research is exceptionally represented, given the, again, community support and academic expertise in this field. We need to work, and we do, on archival, bibliographical, historiographic research, and also, of course, community applications. and so on and so forth. But the important question for us to also to ask is, who are our audiences? Obviously, we work to fulfill the needs of certain categories of and entities out there. Students come to mind first, at least in my world, as well as Ukrainian-Canadian community is next. It requires different exercise in both cases, how to communicate the complexities of the field, or how to communicate to one group, such as students, or how to communicate the findings and the products of our work to, say, Ukrainian-Canadian community audiences. We also have other scholars outside of Canada or in Canada as well. We also have general public, hopefully, outside of the Ukrainian-Canadian situation. Our audiences are also global, and how do we reach out to these global audiences if we are not making an effort, or if we make an effort? I've recently had an opportunity to present a couple of my projects on Ukrainian-Canadian topics in Lisbon, Portugal, and I was surprised how much interest that very domain, how much interest was generated by what I wanted to say and what I had to say to the audiences there. For the people who experience, and not experience, but also research and explore parallel universes, parallel to the Ukrainian-Canadian universes anywhere else in the world. So we really have a lot to share in this field, and we probably should be doing that. We have challenges, of course. I've mentioned already, we deal with marginality of that field in the academics. We're also multidisciplinary, and some of us are either full-time, which is fantastic, but some of us are just part-time scholars of Ukrainian-Canadian studies. Myself included, I consider this being just one of several large agendas I pursue as a scholar, and Ukrainian-Canadian studies are one of several, really. So time-wise, how much time I can spend physically on this topic. The diversity of audiences I've already mentioned. When I was reflecting on these challenges, I recognized that we have the challenge of record keeping. For record keeping purposes, it's easier, for example, to track works that focus exclusively on Ukrainian-Canadian topics, and I'm also a falling victim to this practice. And the comparative scholarship somehow escapes our bibliographies, and it's not really profiled there. Then the next challenge would be for us to deal with this ebb and flow nature of our self-reflection. So when only at conferences of that nature is here, thank you CIES, we have an opportunity to, yet again, to reassert our own identity as a field. We have different obligations to different individuals and constituencies, as I was mentioning. But I wanted to reflect very briefly on the need to interact and dialogue with the different constituencies. I do have my couple of minutes. Yes, yeah, okay, thank you. So, Jars had prepared several questions for us in advance, and I'm trying to work around those and work on those questions as I'm going to reflect on a few more points in the context of what I have to say next. So what are the primary foci of or focus of Ukrainian studies in the next decade? As far as the future directions go, I would like to suggest that we should continue working in dialogue with other cultural groups, such as, say, indigenous peoples, other ethnic cultures in Canada. I've heard from the directors of CIES recently mentioning that you're neighbors with the program in the indigenous studies. What an opportunity, perhaps, to explore a potential collaborative gathering of a kind like this one, and perhaps to reflect on ethnic/indigenous relationships in Canada and invite not just Ukrainianists into that. Something what HREC does when it comes down to Holodomor studies, but this particular discussion is open up to comparative analysis and research. The dialogue needs to continue with the community. Much scholarship takes place in non-academic settings, and we, as anthropologists, as I am, we recognize the validity of that work as well. Between Eastern Canadian and Western Canadian visions of what Ukrainian-Canadian legacy is about. We need to be networking and capacity building. It's always a challenge to maintain, create, and sustain associations, but at least effective networking of research institutions with the mandate to Ukrainian-Canadian studies would be good to have, and we have several institutions today are represented. International Ukrainian Studies network with active online presence would be very good to attend to if we could. And I believe we also need to continue attracting not just Ukrainian-Canadian students who oftentimes gravitate to us because of the innate interest in what we do, but also students from elsewhere, because perhaps through the possibility of comparative research, again, indigenous Ukrainian or various ethnic cultures in comparative perspective. What comes to mind, the thesis of at the U of A some time ago by Aya Fujiwara, in which she compared, I think, Swedes, Japanese, and Ukrainians. Is an excellent piece of scholarship. We had examples of this scholarship taking place in the folklore program at the U of A, where Korean, Bulgarian, and so on and so forth scholars from far away have come to explore the Ukrainian-Canadian and Ukrainian cultures as well. So that I believe is fantastic practice, which helps us to promote ourselves beyond where we are now. But in terms of research and knowledge production, absolutely we need to continue on digging into all these accessible layers of Ukrainian-Canadian culture via folklore studies, ethnohistory, public history, local history, oral history, and so on and so forth. But we need to embrace the humanities, digital humanities in our earnest, not only as the tool for digitization of our archival sources, which is good to pursue, and of course resources come to mind by all means, but these resources on campuses, at least in terms of digital humanities as actual scholarly method of research, are available to us on campus and possible to access through a number of various grants outside of Ukrainian-Canadian context. And they also allow for unique opportunities to mine and explore and data as such as we've heard is being done in literature studies elsewhere. More research on post-1991 immigration and its social mobilization would be also good to see happening. I know Isai's work has taken place some time ago, but this subfield or this group, this constituency is growing and continues to grow, especially here in the West. There's a lot has been done, and with the recent events in Ukraine, of course, a lot of self-mobilization was stimulated or triggered by the external, well, not so external, but these kinds of circumstances. And we should be producing our knowledge in the dialect. And what I wanted to point out that not only we need to publish in peer-reviewed periodicals, but also in open access periodicals. They are growing, they're appearing, and they allow us to disseminate our knowledge in the most effective way because it's easily accessible. I continue habitually publishing with scholarly venues and publishing houses which do not allow free access to my scholarship, and I realize how we are hampered by that. But importantly, I think we have recognized the dialogue which needs to take place with Ukrainian-Canadian studies in Ukraine. And my next couple of minutes, I'm just going to go through those. How many I have? 2 minutes. That's enough. I thought my dear panelists will have an opportunity to focus on what is going on in Canada because they're absolute experts in the field. Therefore, I thought I'll bring in a different angle of what is going on in Ukrainian context vis-a-vis the Ukrainian-Canadian studies. And I'm always interested in some, if you wish, statistical dimensions of these phenomena, scholarly pursuit phenomena as I speak of it. I understand scholarship being a social phenomenon, as I say, with its own agents, with its own directions, agendas, and so on and so forth. For as much as we do in Canada, a lot is happening in Ukraine. Of course, in dialogue with us as well, but let's see what's going on there. We have a number of institutions in Ukraine, as you see on the slides, which are, in one way or the other, are pursuing scholarships out there, with the focus on Ukrainian-Canadian studies. This is, I don't know what happened, hold on. Am I missing a few slides? Okay, well, I'll just go through what we have. For the purpose of our conversation today, what I did, I have accessed what is available with the help of my colleagues in Ukraine and a couple of those institutions and my graduate students. We raked the resources, internet, and we've focused on specifically titles and on works which are published in Ukraine and which are focusing solely on Ukrainian-Canadian scholarship. Again, the fallacy I'm falling in because a lot of other work, comparative work, is done on, say, American and Canadian, Ukrainian cultures. But of course, when we want to understand the dynamics of the field of Ukrainian-Canadian studies in Ukraine, probably the best would be to look at the dissertatii, candidate dissertations and doctoral dissertations. I think this is my slide. The dissertations production is it's a phenomenon of its own. We understand there are some better quality work, some so-called so-so work. And again, there's other ways of judging and the activity of scholars of our colleagues in Ukraine by pursuing what else that they publish outside of the register of these dissertations. Out of all 40 theses we are looking at, which were produced in the last 25 years, 2 were doctoral and the rest of them were candidate. When we look at, I have to say, I don't know what my slides were, they're in order like that. The next way to evaluate the field would be to look at monographs. So what we've gathered, about 20 only publications, which include not just monographs, but book production, self-standing collections as such. We see the work happening in periodical domain, in conferences, of course, followed up, but also monographs have been published, and some of this work is collaborative between Canadian and Ukrainians. But importantly, my point is it's all accessible to the local researchers because of the language and because of how institutes here strive to support publishing houses there. The distribution probably is again very straightforward, well, very expected, but you also see the growth of that field interest in the Ukrainian-Canadian studies outside of traditional centers such as Lviv, Chernivtsi, and now of course Kyiv as being the capital, but it happens elsewhere. And this particular method excludes other comparative work which is produced in Zaporizhia, Sumy, Kharkiv, and whatnot. The other field to look at is this immense number of articles, about 300 articles, which we decided to include in these statistics, is again distributed chronologically, not maybe in the most interesting way, but you can still see the increase of that interest. And I think I don't have anyways, I don't have the geographic distribution, which is not necessarily needed. Right. So in Ukraine, Ukrainian-Canadian studies are a very dynamic area with a huge number of individuals, large number of individuals pursuing this agenda. Only some in cooperation with Canadian scholars, but others quite independently. To summarize, I would probably just leave it where I'm stepping in here because we have more panelists to follow up with some specifics, I believe, in addition to what I had to say. And again, to summarize, let's continue on what we do, but in dialogue with many other constituencies, partners, in order to promote, disseminate, promote ourselves, not ourselves, sorry, but promote what we do, our scholarship, and position us in the better light in the humanities and social sciences. Thank you very much.